Welcome. I think I'll begin. This is a rather large room. If anybody wants to move up, please feel comfortable. We won't be disturbed. So we're going to talk today about epigenetics and crime hotspots. And let me start off by saying that this work, while Rotem and I are leading the sort of effort, this work was very influenced and indeed, you might say, generated by Richard Tremblay, our Stockholm Prize winner for this year. And I had gone to a lecture he gave. We were both keynote speakers in London, I think. And I heard him give a talk about this work in part. And I said, man, that would be interesting in hotspots. So I will say that Richard is a collaborator with us on this work. And so is Kyle Treiber, who's recently become involved. So all of us are a bit involved in this project, though we'll ask Richard and Kyle to comment a little later. Okay, so here's where we're coming from. So you might say if you're not a person who's seriously interested in biology and crime, you think of a sort of classical model, and that is that human behavior is determined by an immutable set of characteristics at birth. This sort of thinking leads to a model of human behavior that is understood not through the experiences and environments of people, but through genetic influences that are imprinted on people. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because this is perhaps why, in some circles, even raising the idea of biology and crime is a very uncontroversial issue. A portrait of predetermined human behavior has been used sometimes as a basis for racist and anti-Semitic policies for crime control and population control. And now, of course, that sort of view of, this immutable set of features of an individual's genetic background that predetermine behavior, it's always been recognized by serious people who study biology and crime, that there's a balance between nature and nurture, that there are factors that influence human behavior from your background, from your biological background, but also influences of genetics. However, when people have talked about this, and I think this has created a strong resistance to this type of thinking, they've always thought of the biological part as immutable, at least traditionally. In other words, it's something you're given, that's what you've got. So that's where listening to a lecture by Richard sort of changed my thinking about this sort of work, because he presented a way of thinking about biology and human behavior that's quite different. Coined epigenetics, it proposes that environments may have an impact on the expression of genes. While your genetic codes are immutable, the genes of an individual may be turned on and off. What this means for policy is that a trait such as aggression may be influenced by biological processes. Those biological processes may be influenced by the environments people live in and work in. So it struck me that this area of thinking was a wonderful way to look at the interaction between nature and nurture. And I must say, when I saw Richard in Jerusalem recently, I thought of the work of Sigmund Freud. In the 19th century, he wrote a book on the interpretation of dreams. It's over 1,000 pages long. I assume most people have not read it. But in that book, he begins with an introduction in which he says, well, I'm going to tell you all about these conversations I've had with people and about the way in which their emotions are developed, etc. But then he said, the reality is that all of these processes are biological, and someday we will be able to examine that way. And I think them that way. And I think, in part, this work leads us to that sort of idea. So what we're going to do today is argue that hotspots of crime, of particular interest in criminology, has direct implications for epigenetics. We're going to illustrate that hotspots of crime are places where social problems of crime are concentrated, and where health and mental health problems are more common, In other words, we're going to tell you these places are places that have very strong influence. A person living in these places is being affected by very strong impacts of the environment on the individual. And our question, which we're going to get to towards the end, because we want to develop a research project to look at this, because this is really all speculation so far, is whether such hotspots, these concentrated environments with high levels of crime and other social problems, places of strong collective disadvantage, whether they have strong influence on genetic expression, and whether that's linked to violence or other crime-related traits. Now, if we're right, then an important new area of consideration for crime prevention presents itself. Place-based crime prevention has been very important over the last 20 years, but this provides an even more interesting cutting-edge and new way of thinking about it. Because by addressing problems at hotspots of crime, we may be able to turn off biological tendencies to crime and violence. And I think that we're not at that stage yet. We're still at the basic research stage, but eventually, if this turns out, the question becomes thinking about hotspots of crime. When people think about them, as I'll show you, they tend to think about them as places where crime occurs. Most of the people working in crime and crime prevention don't think about them in terms of the other collective features and problems that occur at those places, which would become very important in this set of ideas. So here's where we're going today. We're going to start by telling you my colleague, Rotem Leshem. I should have said that at the beginning. I should have introduced each of the people I did in part. Richard, of course, is the Stockholm Prize winner, does not need much introduction. Treiber is let's call it the younger generation of people, hopefully will be here at some time, and is doing very important work on biology and crime, in particular in this interaction between social, individual, and biological traits. Rotem Leshem is a criminologist at Bar-Ilan University who is doing work on neurobiology and crime, and was the person I came to in Israel when I said, this is starting to interest me, what do you think? Okay, so we're going to start by, Rotem's going to start by telling you about genetic expression and why we believe it may be impacted by immediate environmental influences. I'm then going to turn to hotspots of crime and explain why we think it's a locus for such influences, an important focus of epigenetic study. We're then going to tell you a very little bit about the study we're thinking of designing, and we're starting to design now. I've heard there are some real experts in the audience, and I hope they'll get up and raise critical issues and lead us to ideas about how we can think about this and develop it better. As far as I know, no one else has thought about this work in this way. And finally, we're going to open the discussion with Professor Tremblay and Professor Treiber to talk about the implications of this sort of work for criminology, our understanding of crime, and also for crime prevention. So let me invite Rotem.
Good afternoon. Thank you, David, for the introduction. I would like first to start with the current state of the field in research on the relationship between environment, genetic, neurodevelopmental processes, and crime, and then I will incorporate the role of the geographical environment into the field of research. So we know that thoughts, emotion, and behavior are all influenced by the connections of billions of nerve cells affected by genetic and environment. Human structural, functional, and behavioral brain development emerges as an ongoing dialogue between genetic heritage and environment. Basically, our behavior is a reflection of environmental and genetic factors that impact the brain's ability to adapt to changing environmental demands. So the question is how genes-environment interaction affects our brain, defines who we are, and directs our behaviors. So a few words on the developing brain and the role of environment and genes. Neurodevelopment occurs in stages, from birth The brain repeatedly is creating connections between neurons that form our habits, thoughts, consciousness, memories, and mind. The neurons communicate with each other to transmit information. Speeds of connection, melanization, begins at birth, increases more slowly through increase to 2 years old and continue to increase more slowly through 30 years old. And here is an image of synaptic density changes over time and the neural connection. As the picture shows, at birth there are few connections between neurons. By the time a child is 3 years old, here there is an image of 6 years old, the brain has formed about 1,000 trillion connections, about twice as many as adults have. Beginning at about age 11, during adolescent puberty period, a child's brain gets rid of extra connection in process called pruning. The brain is gradually making order out of a thick tangle of wires. So most vigorous growth, pruning, connecting an activity occurs between 1 year through 3 or 4 years old, and neuroscience is telling us that this may be one of the most important periods for developing self-regulation, problem-solving, social, emotional, and language communication behaviors. So the biological changes, the massive biological changes that affect the gross morphology of the brain includes two processes. Regressive, which unused information is eliminated, and within this process, approximately 1 to 2 of the brain is pruned each year during childhood and adulthood, whereas during adolescence, this rises to 15%. The other, or the second process is progressive. This process increases the speed at which information travels between nerve cells. These two processes allowing for more efficient and faster communication and resulting in a higher quality of thinking. The two processes of pruning and melanation play a particularly important role in the interaction between emotional and cognitive processes and their effect on behavior. Environment does matter. The brain is undergoing explosive growth in the first years of life and needs organizing experiences to facilitate development. So synapses in a child brain are strengthened through repeated experiences, and connection and pathways are formed that structure the way a child learns. Learning results in more consolidation of neuronal activity, and brain activity becomes more efficient. Thus, everyday experience with caregivers or other child can optimize the development in neural circuits. Neural circuits that used over and over strengthened, and those that are not used are dropped, resulting in pruning. So we can say that if a teen is doing music or sports or academic, those are the cells and connection that will be hardwired. If he or she lives in high-risk violent crime places, takes risks, participates in criminal and immoral activities, bullying and hurting others, those are the cells and connection that are going to survive. So limited exposure to language, touch, social interaction, or emotional and cognitive neglect leads to structural and functional changes, such as lack of brain growth, neuronal death beyond pruning, and poor cognitive functioning. Here we can see a dynamic mapping of human cortical development. As the development of related neural connection is still taking place, the cortical structures associated with higher order cognitive functions undergo extensive refinement and maturation from infancy to adulthood. The capacity of the prefrontal system, just a second. The capacity of the prefrontal cortex, that is the CEO of the brain, to execute executive control does not appear to be fully maximized until the mid-20s. And if you can see, during the adolescence period, compared to middle 20, around age 20, the parts in the brain that involved in cognitive control is still taking place. It doesn't reach to maturity during adolescence. However, the parts that involved in socio-emotional or emotional responses are fully online. So during adolescence, adolescents are more responsive to and more easily influenced by their peers, and thus more likely to change their decision and alter their behavior in response to social pressure and emotional cues. And research shows that immaturity of the frontal area and the gap between the development of the socio-emotional networks on the one hand and that of the cognitive control networks on the other impair higher cognitive functioning such as moral decision-making, impulse control, and emotion regulation, and may contribute to risky behavior and deviant behavior. Also, studies show that region of association cortex, which integrate information from subcortical areas and support high cognitive activities such as language and executive functions, are those that more clearly show effects of genetic variation. Genes and environment shape the way these neural systems develop and function, which in turn affect multiple complex psychological processes that are important in controlling and regulating and in behaving morally. Specifically, genes do not encode behaviors, but are the building blocks of the cells whose interaction eventually gives rise to those behaviors. Genes affect brain structure by forming neurons connection among major brain regions, and environment and experience refine the connection, enhancing some connection while eliminating others. So, return to the question, how does gene-environment interaction affect our brain and direct our behavior? Genetic research may provide insight into potential links between genes, the brain, and aggressive criminal behavior. Epigenetic refers to heritable changes in gene expression that are not attributable to alternation in the sequence of DNA. The predominant epigenetic mechanism are DNA methylation. DNA methylation is one of the several epigenetic mechanisms that cells use to control gene expression, and not all genes are active at all times. Genes can be turned on and off by environmental events through chemical signals. Thus, genes expression is a dynamic phenomenon dependent on developmental, psychological, and environment signals. Within the context of environment affects the development of behavior through its impact on gene expression, which in turn impact brain development. Environment factors may potentially alter the level and scope of epigenetic regulation of gene expression. So we can say that genes supply the basic blueprint for brain development, but experience adjusts the underlying brain activity and brain circuitry based on the unique environment in which each individual lives. So epigenetic research tells us that environment factors at various levels, such as those related to community, family, or peer setting, are related to alternation in epigenetic pattern during a lifetime. And specific examples for environmental factors that have been linked with altering epigenetic pattern during a lifetime and subsequent risk of deviant behavior are exposure to maltreatment, family violence, parental instability, maternal, mental, and/or physical health, and delinquent peers. This epigenetic alternation may influence brain maturation and the development of cognitive functions such as self-control, emotional regulation, and impulse control, which are critical for the inhibition and regulation of aggressive and criminal behaviors. So the word environment is used to talk about many things. People in different fields of knowledge, for example, history, geography, biology, use the word environment differently. Electromagnetic environment, for example, is radio wave. Here, environments refer to people and events, event that the person lives with, but environment is also places. While genes and environments are both known to influence aggressive and criminal behavior, and interaction between specific genetic variants and many of the environment risk factors described in the literature have been shown to interact, the effect of living in high-risk violent crime places has not been examined. So David will now talk on the crime hotspots and then our new direction for research. Thank you.
So I think the question becomes, we have now developing literature that says that environments will affect the biological processes that affect human behavior. But the question becomes, why should we think the crime hotspots will have an epigenetic impact? I mean, why is it that we should be looking at this as opposed to the more individual-based orientations of prevention that have been developed out of this way of thinking? So I just want to go back and say, we'll start with that the kind of model we're talking about is one that interacts genetics, and we're going to call it hotspots, brain maturation, that then affects individual behaviors, and those behaviors or attitudes and orientations that lead to criminal behavior. So the question becomes, why hotspots in this idea? Well, because environments are important. And over the last 30 years, we've come to understand that microgeographic environments are particularly important. Early on, a number of people, one of the most important articles in this area was written by Lawrence Sherman, the chair of the Stockholm Prize Committee, in which he coined the term the criminology of place. And he and I did a randomized field trial in policing, which was to have tremendous impact. In that field trial, we randomly allocated 110 hotspots of crime, 55 to a treatment group, 55 to a control group. And we then gave the treatment group 3 times as much police patrol as the control groups had, the control spots had. And as you can see here, up until the summer, we had a consistent and strong impact in crime, or moderate impact in crime, some people might say. But anyway, the point of that was that at the time, most people had assumed that the police could not prevent crime. There was literally no strong scientific evidence the police could do something about crime. David Bailey wrote in 1993, I believe, a very well-known book. The first page, he said, there is a myth, and that myth is the police can prevent crime. So here we had, at least in the area of policing, a very strong result, and that result was about concentrating police resources at microgeographic crime hotspots. And I want to just note that when we talk about hotspots, we're not talking about a whole city. We're not talking about a large geographic area. This is from the Chicago School, from Thrasher, who saw a crime developing out of the slum. He would have said that's a hotspot, so to speak, a large hotspot. We're not talking about that. These studies are talking about microgeographic hotspots. On the left-hand side of your screen, you have one study, that's the Minneapolis study, in which you had a street segment. On the right-hand side, a displacement and diffusion experiment I conducted, in which we took a group of streets with a similar type of problem. But irrespective, in these cases, microgeographic units, they're small geographic units, become the focus of prevention, but I would also say the focus of our understanding of crime. Now, an important element of the Minneapolis hotspots experiment, which I came to develop this way later on, this is from a criminology article published last year for my Sutherland address, and that is that what spurred Larry and I on in the early 1990s was research findings that he had developed in Minneapolis that I had begun to develop elsewhere that showed this crime was very highly concentrated at micro units of geography. So, but that was a general statement, and this is just a selection of large cities that I had data from. And I call it the law of crime concentration because it's not just crime concentrates, it concentrates in a very specific way. These are 5 cities that differ in every which way you could imagine. But what I did was I took a specific measure of crime at a specific microgeographic unit. It was crime incidents, generally captured at street segments. And what I found was that there's a very small band, if you like, ranging here from 4.2% to 6% of the streets produce 50% of the crime, and 0.8 to 1.6% of the streets produce 25% of the crime. So this law of crime concentration says there's just tremendous concentration of crime that's fairly consistent across cities. Now, what are the implications of that? The implications early on, the Minneapolis hotspots experiment, is that if you focus the resources, you get to be much more efficient. If you had to focus on changing an entire neighborhood, that cost a fortune. It's very hard to do. But if you only have to focus on a relatively small number of streets, you can get a lot more done. And the question for us was, what about in the area of epigenetics? Do we find this concentration occurring on these concentrated high crime streets? Do we find these kind of processes that we're talking about? And if so, it would provide a mechanism for crime prevention, because it's much easier to go to a place where you have lots of problems, if you like, and focus resources than spread your resources around the city. And I just wanted to note here, this is from a study that I published in 2012 with Liz Groff and Suming Yang. And another element besides the concentration of crime is that these hotspots actually are quite spread out. This is the southern part of Seattle, generally Washington on the west coast of the United States. And generally, this part of Seattle, it's about a third of the city, is considered the sort of bad part, in particular on the right. And those are the bad neighborhoods, so to speak. But we can look here. I used, thanks to Dan Nagin, we used trajectory analysis and developed trajectories of crime over a 16-year period. And the red lines, the purple lines as well, are sort of hotspots of crime. They're places that are hot in a consistent pattern for those 16 years. The green and yellow lines are places with basically no crime throughout that period. So you learn 2 things from this about bad neighborhoods. The first is that most of the streets have very little crime, right? This led the mayor of Seattle to stop calling it a bad neighborhood, so to speak. He called it then the most diverse neighborhood in the city, where 100 languages are spoken. But the point is that it's not that everywhere in this part of town that has many social problems, there's a lot of crime. The crime is focused on specific streets. And the number of red, those are the high chronic hotspots in the city that produce 25% of the crime, the number of them is relatively small, especially relative to the green ones. And there's tremendous street-by-street variability. It's spread around the place. Anyway, so the lessons of this work are that there can be a great deal of efficiency by focusing in on those very small number of streets that have an awful lot of the crime, right? And that is a tremendous cost benefit, if you like. But it also says, don't waste your resources all over the place. Go to where you have these concentrations. Now, if we're talking about environmental influences, obviously crime is not the only thing that affects people. Very high crime rates at places may have an epigenetic effect. We know that crime can create stress and other outcomes. But what I'm going to show you today is these hotspots of crime are not just hotspots of crime. They have a host of other social and economic markers that may impact upon gene expression, which is our concern here. And moreover, I'm going to show you some work we've done lately which suggests that if we look at some of these influences of crime hotspots, I'm going to take a specific example, post-traumatic stress syndrome, it's not just selection, because obviously certain sorts of people select into hotspots of crime. For the most part, unless you're a young person looking to live in the city and trying to get a good deal on housing in a gentrified area, many of the hotspots, obviously, you're not going to select into, you're going to choose to live in a sort of different street. There's elements of selection. But I'm going to try to show you that at least in one case where we try to take into account selection, we could still see the major ways in which living in a hotspot could impact upon an individual, in this case, in the case of post-traumatic stress syndrome. Okay. So now I want to present some data. It's always fun to have data in any event. It's from a study supported by the National Institutes of Health in the United States. We call it the Community Health Study of Places. The study is by myself, Brian Lawton, Justin Reedy, and Amelia Haviland. It's the first prospective study at places examining microcrime places. It's modeled on longitudinal studies of individuals that have been done by Richard and others. What I'm going to do here is use this study. I'm going to take 1 year of survey work to get a sense of the major differences, not only in crime, but in social, economic, health, and mental health outcomes for people who live at crime hotspots. We use survey data from a subgroup of street segments that represent cold spots and hotspots. We use to collect this data face-to-face surveys. They were carried out on a sample of residential streets. We have about 450 streets total in the study. We collected a minimum of 7 survey responses on each street. The cooperation rate for the surveys was over 60%. The surveys took an average of 20 minutes. We had an average of 60 interviewers working on the streets each week in teams of 3. And yeah, just to give you a sense of how hard this particular data collection, on the worst streets here are, it's in Baltimore, Maryland, and in those streets, things can get pretty hot. We had 2 shooting incidents while we were collecting data on the streets when we were there. I don't know how that compares to other cities where we might do similar things. Okay. Let me just note quickly why the street segment. It's both for theoretical and practical reasons in regard to my research. Street segments, in my view, function as behavior settings or micro-communities. As Rob Sampson has noted, there are many levels of community. I think the street segment, intersection to intersection in most modern cities, is a place where people have lots of interaction. They know what's going on their street, when the mail carrier is coming, who walks the dog at a certain type of day, who's home generally, who's not. So we interact with people in a special way, in terms of a behavior setting. These are social units with specific routines, times of day when things are more active or less active. It's also the case they have recognized boundaries. You know when you're going to the next street, things are pretty clear. I should note that for me, the street segment began as an interesting unit because it minimizes data encoding. So it's great when you have a system with X, Y, and coordinates, and you put those X, Y coordinates in a computer system, and you come out with a map of where crime is. But you shouldn't always think that the police know exactly where the X and Y coordinate is, and they're always giving you the right addresses. Now, when we're using sometimes GPS on police officers, you can get much better estimates. If they give you at least you're getting the estimate from where the crime was committed. But at least in the data, for most data still, the police are unlikely to make a mistake on the street it's on between 2 intersections. They are likely to make mistakes about the exact address. As I told you, we had 450 street segments selected from 26,000 about street segments in the city. Our focus today is in the hottest and coldest segments. The 50 hottest segments were in the top 2% of violent and drug crime calls for the selection year. This is Baltimore. You've seen it on your television. There's quite a lot of crime. These hotspots are really hot. The 47 coldest streets, they had fewer than 3 violent and drug crime calls in the selection year. To be eligible, a segment must have had a minimum of 20 occupied streets, so we're not talking about a street that just has shopping on it. We needed to get at least a minimum of 7 surveys per street, and that's how we ended up with that criterion. And for the study, we made sure the streets were not contiguous. So that just gives you a sense of the selection of streets. The blue streets are cold spots, the red streets are hot spots. Okay, so here's the logic. The logic is crime hotspots are special environments where there's a lot of things going on that could have an epigenetic effect. We're looking at those geographies where, at least in my view and Rotem's view, if you're going to have an environmental epigenetic effect from living in the place, these are places where that's going to occur, hotspots. I'm going to be comparing that to cold spots, places that have almost no crime and that are very different in many, many other ways from these hotspots. Okay. And we're doing it because we want to understand criminology. I'm going to ask this question of our discussants later. But we're also thinking ahead in terms of it's much more efficient, as I noted earlier, to bring police resources. You can get a high dosage of resources at hotspots. You can't get as high a dosage of resources if you spread them across a city or even a neighborhood in a city. Okay. First of all, the hot spots are very hot, and the cold spots are very cold. So our hot spots average 264, this is the mean, crime calls to the police in a year. That is, and by the way, the survey N is not relevant here. That's just the number of surveys we collected in those streets. The number of streets is, the hotspots, we have 50 of those. So these have a lot of crime. They average 33 violent crimes and 77 drug crimes. Drug crime is a big issue in Baltimore. You could imagine, in a sense, what the outliers here look like, and the highest crime streets have 500 or 600 or more of these calls, compared to low crime streets, which only have an average of less than 2 calls for violent crimes on the street and only 0.19 calls for drug crimes. But these are also places of collective disadvantage. All these differences are statistically significant. They're also, it seems to me, in effect size moderate to large. 24% of people who live in hotspots are married. This is true of 36% of people in cold spots. This is a city with lots of African Americans, with lots of minorities, but in the hotspots, 86% of the residents of the street are African American. In the cold spots, it's true of only 44%. 75% of the residents of the hotspots have completed some high school, which is actually higher than I would have thought, and 93%, it's true of the cold spots. 57% of people work at the hotspots, and 84% at the cold spots. Percent home ownership even reinforces this idea. 33% of people at hotspots own their own home, and this is true of 65% of people in the cold spots. In other words, it's not only crime that's distinguishing these places. What about if we ask where people are afraid of crime? Are you afraid of breaking into your home? That's true of 13% of the people in the hotspots and 7% of the people in the cold spots. Let me remind you that it's true in many surveys that wealthier people are more afraid of home burglaries. Okay. But what about someone threatening to take your money or property from you? It's true of 9% of the hotspots are afraid of that, only 4% of the cold spots. Someone attacking you on your block. 8% of the hotspots are afraid, but only 3% of the cold spots. What about someone sexually assaulting you? 5% in the hotspots and 3% in the cold spot, and that's a very low base rate. It's not statistically significant. Places where people don't trust their neighbors. In the hotspots, 55% of the people agree that people on their block can be trusted. But this is true of 91% of people who live on cold spots. It seems to me a gigantic difference in survey research in terms of trust. Places with mental health problems. People who live in hotspots, and this is people self-reports, 25% report that they've been diagnosed with depression. It's true of only 14% of the cold spots. But this is an underestimate because people in the hotspots don't go to psychologists as often, whereas they don't get help. So the differences are even larger. If we look at other mental health, other mental illness, 10% of the people report that in the hotspots, and only 4.7% on the cold spots. What about depression symptomology? If you look at depression symptomology, the mean for cold spots is 2.1, for hot spots is 3.65. And what about if we look for post-traumatic stress? It's 0.36 for the cold spots, and about 70% higher for the hot spots at 0.59, and these differences are all statistically significant. But it extends to physical health problems as well. 24%, these are all statistically significant differences, not necessarily very large. 24% of people live in a hotspot claim to have arthritis versus 16% in a cold spot. 26% claim to have asthma problems versus 15% in a cold spot. I should note 60% of the people who live in the hot spots smoke versus 20 to 25% in the cold spots. High blood pressure is about twice as high in the hot spots as cold spots. And again, if we take into account the issue of going to a doctor and getting a diagnosis, these differences are actually much higher. In terms of diabetes, 16% of hot spots and 11% of the people live in the cold spots. These are also places with serious drug problems in comparison. Of people we interviewed, remember, the people we interview are over 21 because of issues of human subjects. In crack cocaine, for both crack cocaine and heroin, about twice as many people in the hot spots are involved with these sorts of drugs as in the cold spots, or have been involved in some time. So hotspots of crime are not simply just hotspots of crime. In other words, I think there's good reason to believe these places have all sorts of things going on environmentally that could affect the individuals, especially children that live in those places. And that's basically our underlying argument. But there's another problem here, and I'm not sure it has to be solved. You can have epigenetic influences even if there's selection. But I wanted to bring up an area where we're able to look at selection in a quietly different way. So we want to ask the question, can you identify direct influence of living in a hotspot, these are adults, not children, on a key health outcome? This would help us, because if you're having these effects on adults, then it would seem the children, who would be much more susceptible, would also be having an effect. Plus children, many of them will be living there from a young age, and therefore selection will not be as critical. But anyway, so we decided to look at PTSD. We've written a paper on this. It's something that's impacted directly by the environment of individuals from studies of communities we know. So we asked the question, if we took into account selection, could we see a PTSD effect? And so we used a two-step process in which we first used propensity score matching to identify a relevant sample of subjects from the street study. We tried to get rid of all those people that couldn't possibly be living on one street versus another. This was done not just with the hotspot streets, but with all violent crime streets, and what we call cool streets as well. We then included these measures in a negative binomial regression model, or models, and we rated the regression model using the propensity score. So we tried our best to deal with the issue of selection. There's no way to deal with it completely outside a randomized study, in my view, but we did a lot to try to get as far as we could. And I should note, we controlled that for spatial autocorrelation because we wanted to isolate the effect not just of the area, but the specific hotspot. So we controlled for the effect for the area outside the hotspot, but within a mile. We focus here on violent crime hotspots, by the way, and compare them to cool and cold spots in our study. So I'm not going to go through trying to show you the study itself, because I want to hear also from our discussants. But if you look at this, you can see that the comparison group excluded is cold spots. If you look at the violent spots, violent crime hotspots, you can see that the effect remains significant in both of these analyses that control out for selection. The first one controls out for social selection like wealth, education, marriage, and all these sorts of issues. And the second one also takes into account a spatial lag and controls out for the larger environment. I will say that the environment within a mile of these places also has a significant effect on PTSD. But the point is, it remains. And for us at least, that raises the possibility that, first of all, these kids are living there from a young age. They're not being selected necessarily, although there is selection of the parents. But there's something going on in these places affecting people, this in terms of a psychological outcome that we can measure and get estimates of with actually a smaller sample, I think, or actually maybe the similar size that we're talking. Okay, next step quickly, I'm going to just give you our thoughts about where we go from here. So we think that environments of hotspots can have a key impact on outcomes for individuals who live at those places. Our example of PTSD suggests that might be the case. And our next step is to see whether it is the case by developing a longitudinal study that allow us to track directly whether hotspots of crime have an epigenetic influence. So that's what I'm turning to now, and I've got to get another, but I'm going to need help. We couldn't do this in the same set of slides because it turns out we're using different formatting. So every time we tried to put them together, chaos came, so we decided to do it this way. Okay. Okay, so we're going to ask three questions. I think you get the sense of what these questions are. First of all, we do want to, in any event, look at the relationship between living in these places and aggression and criminal offending outside of the issue of epigenetics. We want, in particular, to see whether crime hotspots alter specific genetic markers and whether such alterations predispose young people to aggression and criminal behavior. And we want to try to think about how the environmental context of hotspots affect or shape brain mechanisms underlie a reduction in self-control, emotional regulation. So we want to see whether it's true that hotspots of crime have an epigenetic effect. What an amazing thing it would be to show that people who live in hotspots of crime, who are brought up there, end up with different sorts of expression of genes. So after a meeting, I should say, this developed. It's hard to ask them to be the discussants because one of the problems is both of them has helped us design this along the way, but I'm sure they'll think of critical things outside, and we do have a general questions for you. We decided, speaking together, to think of a sample of 400 male adolescents from 12 to age 15, focusing on higher risk adolescents, as did the study in Montreal. We're going to match them, but a key issue for us is there are some people who live in a hotspot now, but were born in hotspots. They're a particularly interesting group. There are people that, whose current residence is in a hotspot, but they were born in cold spots. There are people whose current residence in a cold spot who were born in hotspots, and people who are in cold spots now that were born in hotspots. So there are 4 boxes that we begin with. Within those 4 boxes, we're going to be matching people and trying to draw out some selection issues. We're going to sample from schools. That'll allow us, we now have a database of streets in Tel Aviv, I should note. The study we conducted in Tel Aviv. We're able to identify hot spots, cold spots, and we're going to be going to schools and finding out where the kids live. We're going to go to school, find out the kids, locate the streets, match the hot spot and cold shot streets, and we're going to pair or block our subjects in terms of psychosocial and personality characteristics. We're going to use behavioral questionnaires, which have that problem of self-reporting, but self-reports parent-teacher questionnaires. They've been used in other studies. We're not inventing this, but will be collected. Something that we do have that hasn't been used as much, though, in a study that Kyle is developing, they've also used this with PO. We're going to be collecting data on street characteristics, for example, census data. We have access to the Census Bureau right now in terms of our surveys, but we're going to try to get that to these individuals as well. But in terms of the surveys, we'll be able to get data on information on economic characteristics of the street, on employment, on each of the streets they live in, educational achievement on the street, income, as well as other data collected by the Census Bureau in Israel. Yearly, this is not the decennial census. And of course, we have crime information in each of the streets. We're also, and this is where we'll have a new human subjects barrier to overcome, but we've overcome this so far, and the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics is actually very supportive of research. We want to get, for each of our subjects, we want to get data on their family, education level, number of children, employment status, on national insurance, income tax, all these other things as well if we can. We want to link the data to them. And from, obviously, the earlier I mentioned survey data, we'll have it on number of children, employment status, et cetera. We're also going to want to take genetic markers. And here's the problem, right? We want to know where they were at birth, not just where they are when we get to them in school. So what we're going to do is, in Israel, they collect blood samples, as they do in many other parts in the world, for newborn. And our hope is that they keep those. We think they do, but we're checking on that now. And they're taken at a period between 24 hours and 7 days after birth. So we'll have blood tests of which we can do genetic testing, the PDS scale. We're also, I should note, going to be doing blood tests during the longitudinal study that we carry on. And that's a little bit of makes our research harder because we can't use, it would be easier if we could use swabs, but if we only have at birth the blood test, then the recommendations of our experts was that we should also use blood later on. Okay, so you've been very patient, and we presented a lot of material, but now I'd like to ask some questions of Richard and Kyle, and we discussed this, Rotem and I, afterwards. So you can ignore the questions. Like, you can absolutely ignore these questions, and you can speak about whatever you want, but I'll give the 3 questions, or I don't know if I'll go through them one at a time. But so the questions we had were, what type of epigenetic impact can we expect from the influence of living crime hotspots? Let me state them all, and then you can integrate into your comments. What are the potential implications of this work for understanding the etiology of crime? In other words, to what extent does it fill a gap? How would it fill a gap? Or maybe to some extent it has a narrow impact. And what are the potential contributions to work to crime prevention? I've talked about crime prevention. I've said nothing about it. So maybe if you think that through as well. But Rotem, I agree at the beginning that you guys are free rein to sort of go whichever direction you want. I think we'll start on the left side with Richard.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'll start by the last question because as you were speaking, this idea came, and I think there are many alternatives to how to do this study, and what we discussed in Jerusalem a few weeks ago, and you presented is it's probably the easiest one, but I don't want to forget the idea that came as you were presenting, and it's related to prevention. You were saying that this information about crime spots is being used to reduce crime by police intervention. And as you were saying that, and I was thinking of this morning's discussion with the minister, and it strikes me that why would it be only police that intervene in crime spots? I mean, it's obvious all the problems that we can think of are in hotspots. And I mean, if we can convince whoever is responsible for psychiatric services, health services, education, child health services, randomizing hotspots to having interventions and more or less interventions in these hotspots, then the epigenetic stuff and everything else becomes an outcome that you're looking at. Can we, because the epigenetic idea, doing epigenetic is interesting in itself, but it strikes me since this morning in hearing the talks that there is this, we like to solve intellectual questions about how things work. But in the field we're in, it's not the intellectual questions in themselves that are important. It's solving the crime problem. And solving the crime problem is through interventions. And so I think that we should add in our kit, in our proposal, the idea that this study could introduce a form of intervention that would help us know much better in terms of cause-effect. Do hotspots have epigenetic effects? And also, can we do something about that? Now, the other...
Before you go on, Richard, I just have a question. So are you saying that if we ran a randomized study in which we, and I've been thinking of doing this for other reasons, because if hotspots include all these other social problems, it makes sense to try, why not concentrate your resources to deal with those social problems as well? And that might have an effect on crime. That's always been my thinking. But would you think, if you ran a randomized study in which you took hotspots and cold spots, and then you brought, or you took hotspots and hotspots, excuse me, and then you brought to a random selection of those hotspots like a David Olds type of thing, you know, like, but exactly. Based now on afterbirth intervention. Would you expect those interventions, it's related to the first question, would you expect those interventions to have a large enough effect on genetic expression to be able to measure in a study?
Well, I would measure everything, including, I would measure brain functioning, cognitive development, education. I would measure everything, including epigenetic markers as one of the markers of the impact of the intervention. And if an intervention has an impact on the child's education and also on epigenetics, then it tells us something about the association between these things. So I guess the bottom line is that if it's possible to do an intervention, might as well do an intervention and use brain imaging and epigenetics as a measure of the outcome of the intervention. If there's not enough resources available, then, I mean, we're talking of a correlational study where we measure different aspects of children's development as it relates to the to hotspots. And,
Thank you, Richard.
Oh, yeah, actually, is this on? Can you hear me? Oh, that's better. Okay. Actually, that's a really good point for me to come in, because the work that I do is focused on what I would refer to as the knowledge base, so trying to build up that understanding of the causes of crime and where it comes from. So not so much the aspect of prevention, which is obviously very key, But one of the things that we're very interested in is having a strong knowledge base to inform the interventions so that we can have more effective and more resource effective interventions. And so one of the questions with this kind of research, and it feeds back to even deciding what the research questions are, is what are we going to look at? What are the epigenetic markers that we're interested in? What are the genes that we see that could be of interest? What kind of intervention would we design, and what will we try to impact with it? And then what will we be measuring as the outcome? And all of these questions get very tangled up because we are lacking something really cool right now in criminology, which is that basic understanding of crime and where it comes from. And that, with all of this other information that's coming at us now about biology and genetics and epigenetics and the interaction with the environments, we're having to, I think, reconsider our footing and our understanding. And in fact, Rotem started out by saying that there's a new understanding of the role of the environment in our behavior. And what's very exciting about that is it's bringing us back to remembering that the whole point of behavior is to interact with our environments, is to respond to our environments. So all of those pieces, all of that biological substrate that underlies that behavior is designed to interact with the environment, not just at the point of early development, but throughout our entire lives as we develop and as we behave, in order to help us behave within these environments that are changing. And as social organisms, of course, our environments are very diverse and unpredictable, so we need to have that flexibility. So the epigenetics is very exciting. We talked as well in the very beginning. It was noted about this idea of determinism. David was talking about the worry about this biological immutability, when in fact the more we're learning about our biology, the more we're seeing that it is mutable, that it is responding to the environment. So then understanding those mechanisms better, perhaps we can figure out what are the interventions that would have certain specific kinds of effects that relate to crime. But David also pointed out that we are still at a very embryonic stage when it comes to that knowledge. We're at the basic knowledge stage. So I think this is a really exciting piece of research. It's a really exciting idea about where criminology can go. These first steps need to be taken, but I think there's also a level of caution that has to be taken, and really careful consideration about what the research questions are that we can and should be looking at. One thing that we see from genetic research, although we have a lot of behavioral genetic studies that are saying, hey, genes are important, when we actually look at genes themselves, we don't find very strong effects. Maybe if we look at the epigenetic aspect, that dimension, that will help a bit. But we also know that these genetic effects are multifactorial. They're not just multiple gene effects and gene interactions. There's also environmental factors and interactions that are also occurring along the way. So until we can really model that and frame that, it is going to be a bit of a hunt for a needle in a haystack. And it's exciting that we are actually able to now look at every single piece of hay in the haystack, but it doesn't really move us that far forward, or at least certainly not quickly, to know which ones are the most interesting. So a lot of the work that I'm interested in looking at is trying to nail down more closely about what it is that really leads to these behaviors of crime. So Rotem talked a lot about this development of individuals, development of certain predispositions that people have that may relate to impulsivity, may relate to aggression. Those things we know are important, but we don't precisely know why they're important. When it comes to the point of action, how does that translate into a crime for one person in one situation and not into a crime for another person in another situation? So when we look at these processes, I guess the thing that's a big challenge that I see, but also, again, very exciting, is we have to have the whole equation, the whole causal chain that goes from these factors. And it's not just about action, but it's about developments and how we come to have the predispositions that we have, how we come to have the environments that we have, and of course how the people then encounter those environments and interact with those environments, which actually leads to that crime outcome. And unless we have all the steps from action to cognition to neurocognition, down to development of the brain, the genetic influences, both on development but also at the point of action, once we have that framework, we can start to identify what these key research questions are and what those interventions are. But I think we need to keep that all in perspective. And another thing that it brings to mind, and this is the last point that I'll make, is that there is a lot that criminology has already done to contribute to that pointed action, that idea of the environment and what it does. And so when we start to look at biology and we start to see that it is relevant and that it's important and that it can help us understand better what's going on, we need not to overlook that interactive part. And epigenetics is just a huge reminder of that fact, that it is not just about your biology, it's not just about your person, it's about the environment as well. And so I think it's really exciting that we're moving forward looking at studies that try to bring these things together. But we need to not be divided in our looking at this from a criminological perspective. It needs to be coherent and cohesive. And then I think we may actually be able to come up with some very useful answers, very exciting new knowledge, new interventions, hopefully new potential for understanding and preventing crime.
Thank you. And so we want to hear from the audience as well. We have plenty of time. And while we do that, I'll say for Rotem, Mikhail, or Richard to feel comfortable chiming in if there's something. I also want to give a plug for tomorrow at 1:30 is the Stockholm Prize lecture here, correct? So if you've heard Richard speak, you'll want to come because he's so great. You want to hear him again. But if you haven't heard him, you should definitely come to this because he tells a wonderful story, entertaining story that is just fantastic to listen to. You can see what it led to in my case. It's like big effect. And I was going to give a plenary, so I was paying attention to my work. So obviously very good, very worthwhile. Okay. Thoughts, please help us. Thoughts in the audience. Professor Nagin. Stand up, Dan, I think, so people can hear you.
Specifically, more sort of Richard and Kyle. And it has to do with heritability. And it relates to David. I'm going to sort of bring it back specifically to David's concern about selection, which is going on, is that we know that there's an enormous component of heritability in genetics, and it relates, in genetics. And for the people who stay and continue to live in these hotspots, I just wonder, are these people systematically different than those who move out in ways that would influence, the way they would care for their children, nurture their children, and so forth? You got to scratch your head and wonder, why are some people staying and why are some people leaving?
Can I just add something that may help, Richard? First of all, the transitions of these people is great. They don't stay, people are moving around a lot. So that creates other problems, I'm sure. They may stay in hot spots, by the way, and they may stay in cold spots.
Let me just preface this with another comment on the heritability issue. A couple of months ago, I was visiting Richard in Bordeaux, and he relayed to me the story that there are several million, at least, French Canadians in North America. And Richard, and like most of them, are all the ancestors of a handful of 1,000 or so French people who migrated to North America. And so, that line goes back for hundreds of years in terms of Richard's ancestry, but similarly in Israel and within the Jews, there's similar kinds of heritability that's going on, and for people, for all types of people. And I wonder.
Yeah, I'm also interested in hearing this, but I will say about Tel Aviv that also it's the case that I don't think that it's. I think the data in terms of who's living in hot spots and cold spots are not as, let's call it, people stuck in the same place for long periods of time as much. There's more mobility, even within the city. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, from what I understand, your question then is, you're asking, is there a big genetic effect in the sense of those who live in those hotspots, are they genetically different from people who live elsewhere? And what we know from genetics is that genes select environments. And so, yes, probably there are important genetic differences between those who live in hotspots and others. But the question here, I think we are asking, is what are the environmental effects on gene expression For those who are living in hotspots, and you wouldn't be comparing them to those who are not living in hotspots, but comparing them, if you're talking of doing an intervention, you would be comparing them to people who are living in hotspots where you are not doing the intervention. So a randomized controlled trial where you would not have to worry about the genetic effects. But I mean, if you're doing simply a correlational study and a longitudinal study, I still think that looking at the effects of hotspots on individuals that were born there versus those who have come later, and trying to tease out the short and long-term effects of hotspots would be interesting. And like all correlational study, it will have important limits. And that's why since this morning, and I've been thinking that for a long time, we do longitudinal studies, but if we can do interventions within longitudinal studies, it's much better. My impression is that the only reason we do longitudinal studies rather than interventions, it's a question of money. Is that it costs more to do a randomized controlled trial than to simply do a longitudinal study. And it's a question of convincing people who have the money to do interventions to invest the money in preventive experiments rather than just investing the money in what people are thinking without assessing the impact of these interventions.
Isn't there another, I'm sorry, Richard, I don't know the answer to this question, or Kyle. So my assumption was that there'll be, in both the hot spots and cold spots, even if the process that Dan is talking about occurs, which it clearly does because there's selection going on in any event, even if you're talking about a different sort of selection. So, but it's still the case that there are going to be people in hot spots and cold spots who have similar, if we focus in on a specific gene, there'll be people in both of these groups that have that. And one of the questions we'll be asking along the way, if you had that at birth in Group A versus Group B, is it the case that people live in the violent crime hotspots, in the crime hotspots, for example, that it gets turned, something happens and it gets turned on, et cetera. So we'd still get to do some of that, though I get the problem. We actually found more crossover in terms of background characteristics, et cetera, than we would have thought. And as I said, in Tel Aviv, you may even get more because of the nature of the city. And we've discussed this before, by the way, that Tel Aviv has some disadvantage in that in Baltimore, if you live in the high crime hotspots, you have to be afraid for your life, and it's no joke. Whereas in Tel Aviv, for the most part, even on more serious crime streets, it's not like you fear for your life every day you walk outside, et cetera. This is one of the issues that we spoke about. Other thoughts, questions, contributions? Jersey?
Oh, thank you.
And if I'm missing you, raise your hand higher, because...
Well, I was just thinking that it would be wonderful if you had access to multi-generational data here. Mm-hmm. We have a more generation, not only one generation, but look at the parents or so whatsoever. But you probably can't get it.
In other words, if we had genetic data on the parents, the only way we would be getting at genetic data even on the children is because they were born in a hospital in Tel Aviv or the surrounding area, and they'll have blood tests. But I believe, when did those blood tests begin to be taken, generally?
24 hours after the birth?
No, when historically did we start taking those blood tests?
A long time ago.
It is a long time ago.
I think it's in most countries a long time ago.
Well,
because it would be sort of
that's interesting.
Additional level.
But I think that in Israel, the problem is that many of the parents, I'm not sure that they were born in Israel.
Well, by 19, I looked at the census data. Mm-hmm. The problem she's raising is if you go back to 3 generations. Tel Aviv is a brand new city. It was only created 90 years ago.
That I know, but
100 years ago, whatever. So
I mean,
it's
even
a little tough.
even
But you
2
could go back,
generations would be wonderful,
Rotem,
of
from
course.
From the 1960s, already a majority of people are even
Born in
I think it's
Israel?
that. I have the data, so we can check
Okay,
that.
so, but another question, and regarding your question, Richard, if we collect data on the parents, delinquency, alcohol, smoking, and maybe if we can take examples of their genetic variants here and now, not only when they, can we control this thing? Can we solve the problem that raised
At least we have correlational data then.
yeah.
I mean, it's not different from any other correlational
Correlations.
The
data.
study keeps getting more expensive, Rotem.
Yes,
But I would like
but
very
it's
much.
really good point
Yes,
to see
Jersey,
the
thank you.
parent, to check the parents. Yeah.
I see over there, and as I said, the light's right in here, so please raise your hand high if you want to.
Yes, regarding the selection problem, have you thought about giving a voucher to families living in a hotspot so that they move to a cold spot?
That would make it really expensive, so you're talking about giving vouchers to help them move. We haven't thought about that. That would be pretty cool, right? I mean, if you could the really way to do that, if the government was serious about science in this area and wanted to learn and serious about preventing crime, what you could do is you go to the hospital. You choose a person that now lives in a hotspot, and you buy them an apartment in the cold. You know what I'm saying? You move them. In countries like Israel, it's not as infeasible as you might think because there's a lot of social housing benefits and things of that sort. In any event, there's more. It's not like in Tel Aviv is not as much like American cities where there's this tremendous differentiation in wealth by area because. Here there's a lot of public housing and other housing spread within let's call it the better areas of the city as well. So, yeah, that's interesting. But I don't think we'll be able to do it, but boy, that's a good idea.
Well, I think perhaps this kind of preliminary study can gather information that may help build up the knowledge base so that there's evidence to say this sort of thing might be useful, this kind of move to this kind of area, or these differences are there. We don't have enough knowledge, I think, to justify that kind of expense yet, but potentially.
But if we found, for example, if we look at spatial relationships, we found that within a mile, that if you live in a hotspot, but the mile air around you is colder, but that reduced the, you know what I'm saying? You can get some interesting things like that. Other questions, it's okay if you just want to get up and go home, but because at the end of the day, I understand that. But go ahead.
What Silvana just suggested has been done. I don't remember the name of the program, but Leventhal and Brooks-Gunn did that in the U.S., paying for low SES people to move in richer areas and so on. But that's not my point. Just to say that.
Remind me of who did that study?
Brooks-Gunn. What's the name of the program, Dan, again? Moving to Opportunities.
We should look at that anyway for other reasons. Can you write that down?
My point is, based both on Dan's point and the gentleman in front there.
Jersey.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay.
Co-chair of the committee for the Stockholm Prize.
If you want to make a fair comparison between the blue and the reds, you need to control for your baseline level of methylation and epigenetic processes. So you will need 2 data points at least, that's for sure. Only one will not tell you whether you created differences, but whether the hot versus the cold spot created differences because you don't know whether the differences were there to start with. And
no, we're going to have a measure. We're going to have a measure at birth, right?
Okay.
So, that was the problem we went into. How the hell do we get back to then and still look at people? There's limits to what you can request money for. So that's where we came up with the idea of going to the hospitals and getting a blood sample of the kid at birth, which there should be. Should and is not the same thing.
So.
And then we would be able to have a baseline for each individual. That doesn't take into account the selection issues that Dan was partially referring to. But yeah, you're like, you know, whenever you do something really new, you're like in the darkness, you make a million mistakes. Like I always find it strange when people want a groundbreaking study in a new area to be as neat and clean as a study that's developed after 50 years of work in that area. So any problems being brought up at the beginning is good. So you want to add something else?
Well, then you may find that there are no differences in epigenetics between the blues and the reds. Hopefully, if there are no intergenerational transmission of epigenetic effects from the previous generation, that's fine. But you will not be able you will probably have differences in the genome, in genotypes between the blues and the reds. And
Yes.
this was Dan's point. But there, you have the blood, you can genotype. It doesn't cost that much money to genotype, 1,000 participants anymore, genome-wide. You have to do that.
So you're suggesting, because we were originally thinking of doing something more specific, right? Wasn't that? Or that was original. So he's suggesting that it's not that much more costly to do map the entire genome. Okay.
Because then you can match your participants, the blues and the reds.
We could also know what the differences are better.
Absolutely, and it will document whether there are differences, and you can control for them eventually through propensity scores or other strategies. But then the random assignment you could do only with the hotspots. You don't need to do that with the cold spots. The cold spots
Right.
will be your comparison group, non-randomly assigned. But within the red spots, it would be interesting to do that and see whether there you create differences in the epigenome, starting with a randomly assigned groups that are probably equivalent on the genome to start with, and other and environmental variables as well, because you may control for the genome, but you will not control for the interaction between the genome and all sorts of daily experiences beyond being exposed to a high crime environment. And finally, your point was very well taken also about what are the processes that are the daily processes that are running in these families, within these individuals, between these individuals. I don't know if you plan to do interviews with the participants over
Yes.
time.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
And surveys, et cetera. So we will get a sense of that, but of course we're missing, retrospective memory is difficult, and we're going to capture these people and ask them also about what happened earlier, and that data is, of course, not as good as you would like. Any other questions? I think we'll let you go. Thank you very much to the panelists and to the audience who's very patient.